we often think of the Vietnam War in terms of just the 1960s, but the Vietnam War really began at the very end of World War II. The major powers were unable to come to any kind of agreement on how to make peace in the world, and it was an extraordinarily volatile time, particularly with former colonies trying to gain their independence. Remember, in 1948, India began the really serious withdrawal of the old 19th century, 18th century colonial system by throwing out the British Raj. Throughout the 1960s, other former colonies, particularly in Asia and Africa, were able to become independent states. And this is not a very easy process, even when there's not an actual war that goes on. Well, the same thing happened in Vietnam. And we can actually track 4 different stages of what we can call the Vietnam War. The French, remember, had colonized what then was called French Indochina, which included at least parts of Laos and Cambodia, as well as all of Vietnam, as of the late 1880s. Now, when the Japanese invaded in the 1930s and 40s, driving the French out, many of the Vietnamese in particular resisted the Japanese takeover. And when the Japanese were routed and expelled, these same people, led by a single national leader named Ho Chi Minh, then petitioned the United States directly to assist them in creating a free nation. But the United States was unable to do this, which we'll talk about in just a second. Anyway, beginning in 1946 and going till 1954, we can talk about the first Indo-Chinese War. And this is how the Vietnamese look at the stages of the Vietnam War now. The second, these labels come from Vietnamese, or the Vietnamese take on the thing. The first Indo-Chinese War from 46 to 54, the second Indo-Chinese War from 57 to 65, the American phase of the war from 65 till 73, and then what the Vietnamese call the reunification phase from 73 to 75. What we talk about in the United States is primarily the latter half of the Second Indo-Chinese War and the American phase through reunification, and we call it escalation and Vietnamization, or Americanization and Vietnamization. So the periodization is a little different than what you're seeing here, but to look back prior to about 1965 and to see it from somebody's point of view other than our own, which might give us a better way to compare and contrast so we can solidify our own ideas, these stages function very well. Now, we want to look at U.S. intervention prior to 1964, and like I said, the Truman administration, because it wanted to bring the extremely nationalistic French into a collective security agreement that turned out to be NATO, and the French were resisting that, then the United States under Truman refused to help the Vietnamese under Ho Chi Minh, and rather assisted France to retake its former colony of French Indochina beginning in 1947. The Vietnamese resisted this. We provided logistical and diplomatic support. We didn't provide troops. The French Foreign Legion provided the troops and made some serious errors, culminating in the 1954 Battle of Dien Bien Phu near the Laos border. They were routed at Dien Bien Phu and had to leave, whereupon in the negotiations in 1954 in Geneva, the French volunteered to leave. The Americans guaranteed a 1956 election. And then when it was obvious that Ho Chi Minh, who had adopted much socialist and communist rhetoric, if not programs, when it was obvious he was going to win over the hand-picked president of Wo Jin, then we negated that election unilaterally, refused to allow it to be held, and this started the 1957, which you don't see here, basically the beginning of the Vietnam War, in which the Viet Minh reactivated themselves and from the old Japanese days and began fighting to unify the country under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh. The word Minh means freedom, by the way. We began sending in military advisors after 1957, and we, particularly the Eisenhower administration, thought about Vietnam according to what John Foster Dulles had called the domino theory. And this was that if one of the nations of Southeast Asia fell to a communist-inspired uprising or a communist attack from the outside, primarily we're talking about China here, then other countries would fall like dominoes falling over. I'm not real sure if anybody took this very seriously except as a propaganda tool, but it did inform all of the propaganda and discussion about what to do in Southeast Asia for the Americans. For a long period of time, it was used to justify any military intervention there. And primarily, we were trying to protect Thailand and the Philippines from communist insurgency. But this then is the domino theory, and it did inform American foreign policy throughout the Vietnam era. Coming into the presidency in 1961, Kennedy authorized a coup against our own handpicked leader, Diem, and he committed 16,000 advisors between 1961 and 1963. Now, the problem with tacitly, he knew this coup was coming and didn't try to stop it. Tacitly allowing a military coup against Diem, who was corrupt and ineffective anyway. On November 1st, 1963, then destabilized the South Vietnamese government so badly that between November of 1963 and the spring of 1965, South Vietnam endured 5 total military coups. And this was in the period leading up to the Americanization of Vietnam, of the Vietnam War. Let's look now at some of the players in the Vietnam War. You can see in the upper right is Diem, spelled D-I-E-M. Below him is one of the first coup leaders, Nguyen Van Ky. Ky was overthrown ultimately by Nguyen Van Thu, who you see in the middle. And of course, the nemesis of all of these guys was the leader of North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh, who you see in the lower right. Okay, this then is the background to the Americanization and the Vietnamization phases of the Vietnam War. And as always, thank you for your attention.